Good evening. I'd just like to start a new series on the World Championship match between defending champion Vishy Annand and challenger Magnus Carlsen from 2013. I apologise for that. I've been a bit lax with my videos in the last few days. I've played an over-the-board tournament at the weekend. There will be some analysis of some games from that tournament later in the week. But I played an over-the-board tournament at the weekend, so there was only pre-loaded videos that were loaded up to the channel. And today I worked one of my rare day shifts, and I have a day shift tomorrow. So, you know, I had to go to the chess club tonight to help out with the coaching, and now's my first chance to be making this video. I'll just say that it was only about 6 months before the 2013 World Championship that Magnus Carlsen won his first classical game against Vishy Annand. It was an 84 move endgame grind. It was a very good game. And the match started. The World Championship match started very evenly. Annand had a chance in the first game, and Carlsen managed to find a drawing line. And Carlsen had a chance in the second game, and Annand managed to find a drawing line. The third and fourth game were very even, and nobody got a real chance out of them. So this is the fifth game, and the challenger Magnus has the white pieces, and Vishy has the black pieces. Let's see what happens. So c4 from Magnus, the English opening. f6, e6 from Vishy. This is known as the Agincourt defence because it's the English c4 against the French e6. Battle of Agincourt was the English against the French. That's today's history lesson finished. d4, d5. We're now in an ordinary Queen's Gambit decline position, and the Queen's Knight comes out, the Queen's Knight variation. He goes straight into the semi-slab. This is called the accelerated move order, where you bring out the next pawn to defend d5 before taking any pieces into the action. It comes to d4 e4 immediately, and it's swapped off, and he takes back with the knight, and he plays the check. And the knight comes back. He's not afraid at this point in time of bishop taking and the doubling of the pawns. This is called the forgotten variation of the Queen's Gambit decline because it's not played so much now. And in 2013, that was certainly a strong part of Magnus's game, that he played unusual and unexpected sidelines and got reasonable positions out of them. So the pawn comes to c5 to try and break down the central structure, and Carlsen asks Annand if he really does intend to swap off the pawns here, or is he just pretending? Annand says, well, let me think about that for a minute. And Carlsen develops another piece, and Annand develops another piece. And Carlsen develops another piece, and now he's threatening to play bishop takes pawn, especially since the rook is now covering the queen. He won't even lose castling rights for doing that. So the knight comes to c6 to defend that pawn, and the queen comes to d3 to allow the possibility, the threat, if you like, of castling queenside, and also meaning that now he can take this and take back with the bishop, putting his bishop in a good position. So he takes, and Carlsen takes, and the knight comes to g4, threatening the bishop. And yeah, the rook comes to, he castles long, putting the rook on d1. Unusual, but good position. The pawn is taken, and he takes back with the pawn. Now his pawn structure is a bit ruined, but he does have the possibility of a storm on the queen side, pawn storm on the queen side with b5, and he does have the semi-open f file if Annand should castle short. So the bishop withdraws to c7, a good place for it, and he takes the knight, so that there's never any more idea of Annand castling queenside. It's far too airy. You might think this leaves some weaknesses around his own kingside and queenside, and indeed it does. The queens are swapped off and the bishop takes, but now that the queens are swapped off, those weaknesses on his queenside are weaknesses against a possible attack. He's actually got a better pawn structure with his 3 against 2 here, and he feels that he's 3 against 4 here, he can just about hold up. And of course, Annand's got the bishop pair. King comes to e7, and the bishop comes to f3. Long diagonal, brilliantly placed, and looking at the pawn on c7. He doesn't want to come to b7 to defend, because immediately this goes into a pin, and he could use the opportunity to play knight to b5, and then he threatens come into d5, d4, where he attacks the pawn. So yeah, but instead he comes to d4, e4, so that he's threatening to come here and overwhelm the bishop. Bishop comes to f6 to prevent that, but Carlsen does have the possibility of playing c5, and he plays it immediately, restricting that bishop greatly. So the pawn comes to f5. He's saying, yeah, well, if you want to swap off the bishop pair, fine by me. So he takes, Annand takes back, and of course Carlsen plays the in-betweener, the pawn push, so that the rook has to move, so that, yeah, he doesn't get to take back with the pawn, so that his pawn structure is permanently damaged. The rook comes to b7, and if we just stop for a minute, we're well into the middle game here, and and coming near to the end game. It might be tempting to call it a queenless middle game, might be tempting to call it an end game. What's the pros and cons for both sides? Both sides have 3 islands of pawn, have their pawns split up, but Annand has 4 pawn islands, and Carlsen has 4 pawn islands, 3 pawn islands, sorry, 2 twos and a 1. And Annand's got a 2, a 1, a 1, and a 1. So he's got 3 isolated pawns. And they're all backward pawns. This is the only backward pawn on the Carlsen side at the minute. This pawn is backward but can't be attacked. Yeah, it's just a slightly more solid setup for Carlsen, who also takes the F file first opportunity. Rook comes to b5, maybe he's thinking about playing rook here check and trying to do something, or doubling up the rooks here and going against the structure here. The rook comes to f4 to maybe think about challenging here, maybe think about doubling on the e file here, d file here. The pawn comes to g5, and he pulls back to f3. He's not going to chasing after it right away, because the pawn would then come here, and then the rook is forced here, and it's really not getting out of that little box. So pawn comes to h5, and he's now threatening to come to g3, g4, and attack the rook. But Carlsen says, yeah, if you attack my rook, I'm just coming to f7 and saying check. So the bishop has to come to e8 to guard the f7 square. And the bishop retreats, so that he may at some point in time be looking at playing bishop here, or attacking the rook, or bishop here if he can. Yeah, just making things better. So the knight, as bishop even, is pinned immediately by the rook. But Carlsen comes to c6 to prevent the bishop from coming to g6 and attacking the pinned piece. And also, the bishop can't come here, because it can be taken by the rook. And if it comes here, then it's standing in the way of the pawn, of the rook coming to the d file. So actually, his pieces are a bit, misplaced, miscoordinated. I've talked before about playing the rook to d8, e8. Yeah, when you play this for your own positional reasons, it's a good idea. When you're forced back there and it cuts the communication between the rooks. It's a bad idea. So he takes a bit of space with h4 and then gives himself the opportunity to play bishop here, to then have the opportunity to double up with the rooks or play the rook onto the open file. So good move. He comes to e4, sorry, so that he's permanently blocking, or at least blocking for now, that diagonal. Yeah, expansion on the queen side, very good. King comes out to the middle. No danger, because you can't come check here because the bishop's in the way. The rook comes to b5, and the pawn comes to b3. This turns out to be a brilliantly calculated strategy for defending his kingside, his queenside structure. The pawn comes to h5 so that the rook can come here, check. The king comes already to c3 so that it's not check here. He plays check on c5 and the king finds the brilliant square b5 where everything is kind of held together and well defended. Annand plays d8. Of course, he's threats to come to d2 and pin the already threatened rook. Carlsen doesn't allow that. Plays rook to f2 and the rook comes to d4. But it's not really threatening the pawn because the pawn is defended by the bishop. The rook comes to h6, defending the attacking the bishop and also giving himself access to the f7, h7 square for a check. Bishop comes to d1, great square for the bishop, and really if he takes the bishop here, there's not going to be much chance of progress for black. So he placed the bishop to b1. It looks like he's just getting forced back and back into a corner, but he's actually calculated this really, really nicely. And he comes out with his king again, so that he's threatening the rook, so that it doesn't matter if he gets checked, he will be winning that rook anyway. So the rook is defended by the pawn on c5. And the rook comes to b1, tucking in nicely behind the pawns. Just, lovely. Lovely. It's like one of those 15 puzzles where you have to slide things into place before other things can go into place. It's beautifully played by Carlsen. And the rook comes to g6 to threaten the pawn. And the pawn comes to a4 to threaten to take with the bishop. And if he takes, take with the pawn, if he takes, threatening to take with the rook, then the bishop or the pawn. He's got 3 attackers on this pawn, which is defended twice. Sufficient defense at the minute. So he takes, and Annand takes with check, Carlsen takes back, and the bishop takes. And now he might be in a position to possibly take control of this second rank, in which case this pawn is going to be weak. But Carlsen takes pawn and says check, king comes to d6, and he goes back to h5 and uses the h-file again to threaten this pawn. Rook comes to d1 and he's threatening the bishop. But he says check first. Brilliant, brilliant. Another 15 puzzle sliding bricks move. He moves the bishop so that the pawn with check, defended by the rook, so that the bishop has another square to move to. King comes to d5 and he plays bishop to f7, and now he's threatening to play bishop g8 check, take this pawn and then take this pawn. Brilliant. King comes to c1 and he comes to b2. So it's making that threat stronger, and Annand can't play rook to c2 check because it's covered by the bishop. So he comes to g1 to threaten this pawn. Carlsen plays the check, plays another check to get the king in a worse position and to make this pawn closer to being a new queen. Great. King comes to d7 and the bishop is taken and the pawn is won. But Annand wins a pawn back. Carlsen takes pawn and now he's got 3 against 1. and the king comes into the middle, and the pawn pushes. And the king takes, and it's 2 against 1. The pawn pushes again. The king comes a step nearer to stopping the pawn, and the rook cuts the king off from getting to attack the pawn. The pawn can get to a7, and the rook is cut off from playing to a2 by the king. King comes to d5, pawn comes to a6, comes c4 check, and the king comes to c3, and the rook comes to a2, and the pawn goes to a7. King comes to c5, and the pawn pushes again, and Annand resigns because there's nothing he can do. If he comes after this pawn, then this pawn queen. So he's got to keep his pawn there, and then Carlsen can just keep pushing this pawn. And even checking here and trying to force the king back, yeah, it's not going to work because that will give him the opportunity to play rook here, check, and then push this pawn one more time. He can't any longer stop both the pawns. A brilliant strategical middle game which led to a one-end game. Then Carlsen takes the lead in the World Chess Championship after 5 games. It's 1-0 to Carlsen. Don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe to my videos. Thanks. Bye.